great to be here. It's great to see you this morning. If it is your first time at Fellowship of Faith, I want to welcome you. It's great to have you. Hopefully, you have been made to feel welcome. And if you haven't been, let me know. I'll at least make you feel welcome, but I don't think that's the case today. If it is your first time and you've never filled out the little yellow card that's in the back of the seat, if you would do that, please, and let us just know so we can know you were here. There's a box outside at the desk that's in the lobby that you can place that in there. They'll give you a gift, and I will do nothing more than send you a letter, I promise. So if you do that, we're excited to have you here. If you fill out that card and everything, and you want to just take the time, make sure that you connect with me sometime this morning when we're finished. I would love to meet you, talk to you, kind of find out maybe what brought you here to Fellowship of Faith, and maybe answer any questions you might have. I want to remind those of you who are members that we are finishing our vote for our budget and our leadership this week. It's out at the Connection Center, the same desk. The budget is there. The proposed vision team people are there. We've had the budget has been out for probably about 5 weeks. 6 weeks for people to look at. Everything's out there. There's a card there. You'll just check yes for the budget or no, yes or no for the vision team members who are coming in. And those of you who've already voted, thank you for that. But that's out there, and I will give everybody the final details on that next week. Also, today marks another change in the way we're doing things. Tonight at 6 o'clock, right? The middle school and high school students are transitioning to beginning meeting at Chris and Ashley Brown's house in Bidwell. So if you don't know where that is, you can connect with them. You guys stand up for just a second. Okay, that's Chris. That's Ashley. They can answer any questions you might have, and it's a really exciting. They've been meeting together for a while in a home. It's been going really well. But this is a great opportunity if you have kids who are in middle school or high school, and maybe they've been a little bit iffy about coming to youth, and maybe they felt like the group was already started and all that kind of stuff. It'll be a great night to start because it's Chris and Ashley's first night too. So they've got some stuff planned. I think it'll be great. I'm really looking forward to seeing what God does through our middle school and high school students over the next year. We're going to talk about, or last week we discussed this idea of the state of the church. And through the whole process, and we kind of reviewed 2015 and talked a little bit about what we're going to do in 2016. But what we landed on last week is this image of the idea of cultivation. The idea of eliminating those elements in our experience with other people who are maybe far from God or who have questions about God, doing everything we can to eliminate those barriers. And we use the story of the farmer who spread his seed out, and we talked about all the different types of ground and things like that. But the idea was this idea of cultivation, the idea that for farming, it's not a one-hit thing. You don't just go out, spread your seed, and just let it happen and let the cards fall as they may. It is a constant mindset of working and cultivating and creating opportunities for that crop to do what it needs to do. And it takes effort, it takes time, it takes knowledge and wisdom to do that. And as we look at the next 2016, as we go through the rest of our year and the rest of the existence of Fellowship of Faith, we must look at it as farmers, as if we're cultivating and we're being mindful of what God wants to bring forth with the harvest in mind. And so when we think about this idea of the State of the Union, there's always here's what we did, here's what we're going to do. And then there is the discussion most people don't like, the discussion of the cost. It's not always pleasant, and depending on what side of the aisle you land on. Either you're irritated because the government is going to be taking more of your money and then doing whatever the government does with it, or you're irritated because you're being told that the money that the government is taking is going to go to things you don't appreciate, Or many other responses happen when we start thinking about the State of the Union and the idea of what the cost is. And so we also often feel like this, at least I do, when you're reading the State of the Union, that you're being coerced, that the president is standing up there and they're going to say, we're going to do this. And sometimes the president says, we're going to do this whether you like it or not. And we're going to take what we need from you in order to accomplish this goal. And it's frustrating. And it's worrisome. And sometimes when we're in churches, it translates to that in other topics, when we discuss certain topics. But it kind of goes along with a little bit, I guess, because we think that everybody wants something from us. We look at the government as wanting more from us. We look at the world and it's full of greed and consumerism, and we just kind of feel overwhelmed because of maybe our own financial state, because the fact is it feels like that the more you give, and it's never enough. And we get frustrated because when we're watching the State of the Union, we see the state of our country, and we feel like we're always being asked to give more, but it's because there are other people on the other side who are always asking and expecting more from us. And so we struggle a little bit with this idea. And we look at politicians as greedy, we look at other folks as greedy. Sometimes we often look at churches as greedy. And I think that we all can come to the conclusion that, or maybe not, but there's this mindset in our world that we need more. Regardless of whether it's our government or whether it's just out in the general population, whether it's looking at Christmas and the amounts of gifts that are given, this idea of getting more and of being consumer-driven is just the way our country works. And actually, I'll just tell you, on a regular basis, like weekly, I get email messages from organizations who are targeting me specifically as a pastor, telling me, here are the 5 different strategies you can use to get people to give more. Here are the things you can do, because we know you want more money. And it's infuriating to me that it even has, in many ways, crossed over into the church mindset and the mindset of people who are focused on church growth and on things like that, where they believe that we have to always be looking at grabbing more, getting more, being greedy, and consuming everything we can consume. And if you look at Facebook, you look at social media, you look at just in general, there's this common conversation about the greed and the consumerism and just the mindset of selfishness that exists in our world. Until recently, the word affluenza didn't exist. But to actually have people who were viewed as unable to make a logical, moral decision because of the fact that they've never been told no, as a legitimate defense toward killing somebody on the road. We live in a world that is wrapped up in greed and consumerism. And so what we need to focus on, what I think that when we think about this idea of cultivation, what we must do as a fellowship of faith, as followers of Christ, is we must cultivate the heart of generosity. We must be the opposite of everything we see and hate about our culture. And so we must look at it from a different viewpoint. We must understand that when we start talking about generosity and we start talking about money, it's not just a financial discussion with us. It's not just a matter of the church wants you to give a certain amount so they can go do whatever they want with it, or so the pastor can drive awesome cars or build bigger houses or any of those types of things, which hasn't happened. Unless a Ford Escape is awesome and something changed since yesterday. But it's a spiritual conversation we must have when we start talking about generosity. a spiritual conversation. And it's hard because it's challenging. It's tough when we start talking about generosity. It's tough, but it's the only remedy for the way the world works. I'm pretty vocal about the fact that I struggle with being optimistic that anybody who is elected will make things better. I struggle with that. I acknowledge that. And if you're politically active, go for it. I'm excited for you. But I struggle with that. And the reason I struggle with it is because so often the people we put into place are people who represent greed and consumerism, even if that's not what they tell us. I struggle with it because money continues to go and be poured into political situations and into plans and things like that. And the response is that things have not changed for the better. And the reason for that is because God has not called Republicans and Democrats to be the voice of the message of Jesus Christ. He has called us to be that message. He has not called countries to be generous. He has called you to be generous. And so when we start talking about this, we start talking about generosity, there are multiple responses. We hesitate. Well, wait a minute, Jamie, I've given this much, and I have a list of all the things to which I've given. And we hesitate a little bit. We hesitate because we know that we're going to be challenged or asked to do something different. We get irritated because maybe we went to a church that talked about money all the time, or so we thought. Or we get irritated because we are hearing it in multiple places and are just like, oh, come on, we understand, we're all horrible people, we should be more generous, can we move to something else? I would really, really like to binge watch something right now, so please stop telling me I need to be generous with my time and my money. We dismiss things, or we say, that's really good. Jamie, that was a wonderful message. It had no effect on me, but it was wonderful. We develop assumptions. And let's face it, when we watch the State of the Union, people start talking about the kind of money and what they're going to be doing as far as cutting taxes or raising taxes. There are all kinds of assumptions that go into that. Well, that's because he's in this group's pocket, or he's in this group's pocket, or she wants to do that. And when we come into churches and we start talking about generosity, it's the same thing. Pastor must want another vacation. Church must have decided that they're going to do something else, and it's just going to be, we have these assumptions that we deal with. Some of us struggle with guilt because we know that we've known the right thing to do as far as generosity is concerned, but we haven't been doing it. And so we feel like that when these messages come out, that the purpose of it is to shame people or to guilt people. Or we look at the fact that we look at our current situation and say, we would love to be generous, we just can't. It just doesn't work right now. And regardless of your reaction to this idea of generosity, and I think it's funny, and it has to be, I'm assuming it's God, that we have one of our larger crowds for the last 9 months, and I'm talking about money. I'm just going to take it as a good sign, not. But we have to think about this idea of generosity. We have to cultivate it. And one of the things that I want you to think about is we're going to look at 2 Corinthians, and we're going to be in chapter 9. If you change there or move over there right now, we have a great story. There's a passage in here from Paul, who wrote this letter to the Corinthians, the second letter he wrote to the Corinthians. And the great thing about it is it talks about this idea of generosity, but it starts with the same image that we discussed last week of farmers and cultivation. We're looking at chapter 9, we're going to start with verse 6. Remember this, a farmer who plants only a few seeds will get a small crop, but the one who plants generously will get a generous crop. You must each make up your own mind as to how much you should give. Don't give reluctantly or in response to pressure, for God loves the person who gives cheerfully. And God will generously provide all you need. You will always have everything you need and plenty left over to share with others. As the scriptures say, godly people give generously to the poor. Their good deeds will never be forgotten. For God is the one who gives seed to the farmer and then bread to eat. In the same way, he will give you many opportunities to do good, and he will produce a great harvest of generosity in you. You will be enriched so you can give even more generously. And when you take your gifts to those who need them, they will break out in thanksgiving to God. So two good things will happen. The needs of the Christians in Jerusalem will be met, and they will joyfully express their thanksgiving to God. You'll be glorifying God through your generous gifts, for your generosity to them will prove you're obedient to the good news of Christ. And they will pray for you with a deep affection because of the wonderful grace God was shown through you. Now, there's a specific situation. Thank God for a son, a gift, too wonderful for words. This is a situation. Paul is actually writing to the Corinthians. They're taking up a collection for the Jews or the believers in Jerusalem. And they're taking money. He's taking money up specifically for that. And so he talks about that. That's what he's talking about toward the end. But what I want to look at is the ideas that are wrapped up in here with this idea of generosity that we often, even as Christians, miss. Okay, first of all, there's this idea of planting and reaping, right? Planting and sowing. And we talk about that people talk about you reap what you sow, and usually they're saying that in a derogatory term, hoping someone's going to get it for something bad they did. But this idea of if you plant, you have a harvest. If you do not plant, you cannot expect a harvest. And I like the idea that when he says, if you reap sparingly, if you sow sparingly, you reap sparingly. If you don't put many seeds out, don't expect a bumper crop. So there's that part of it. And so there is this element of giving and having a image of giving big to the ministry of Christ. But I also want to help you realize there, it also says it's a matter of personal choice. There's nothing that's compelling you to do that. This is the difference between coming and being part of a community of faith and being an American citizen who makes over a certain amount of money and is compelled, therefore, to give money to the government. This is of your choosing. It is a decision based on you, but the fact is, it's more about the attitude with which you give it than the amount that you are giving. That you're giving out of whatever you have. And so it's a personal choice, and it is a matter of your attitude. But I want to look in that scripture just for a second and look at some descriptions of God in there. Okay? It says we have a generous God. This one passage, if we didn't read anything else, would show us the generosity of the God we say we serve. It says he provides the seed and the crop, and he doesn't even stop at the crop, and the food that is made from the crop. Okay? He provides needs. It says that God is a generous God. He gives you everything you need and will give you more. He will give you the resources you need to bless other people. He will give you a harvest. I love this, and I don't know what verse it was in. There's this phrase that's used in the New Living Translation, I think specifically. It says, if you are giving and you're being generous and you have the right attitude and you're making those choices, he says, God will give you a harvest of generosity. That even the generosity that maybe is missing right now, God will give you. If you are willing to give, if you make the decision to give something, that God will give you a harvest of generosity. Now, I don't know what your personal opinion is about that. I don't know where your heart is about that as far as maybe there are people who are naturally generous. I have 3 kids, and they're all naturally generous, but one of them, the youngest one, will give anything he has to anybody. If someone needs something, we went to Washington, D.C., and went by many homeless people when we were in Washington, D.C., and he wanted to help all of them. And had a hard time understanding why, and there's a lot of there are a lot of reasons why you do and don't do that. But he's naturally, from the moment he was born, that's his personality. If you know Luke, you know that he generously gives everything, particularly hugs. But that is his mindset. That is the way he is built. Others of us are not built to be naturally generous. We are built to be naturally the other way. Maybe we're naturally consumeristic. We're naturally takers. Or maybe it's not that we're takers, but we're naturally people who have a tendency to like to keep what we have and keep a hold of it and keep our hands on it. Because if I have my hands on it, I know what's going to happen with it. If I give it to somebody else, they may misuse it. And so for you and for all of us, we have this promise that if we will be willing to acknowledge the God who has given us the things that we have, who takes care of our needs, who loves us, and as the end of the passage says, who gave us his Son, if we are willing to acknowledge him and to be generous on just a level that we have decided, a level that works alongside what we have and what we need and all those types of things, we just give that much. He will give us a harvest of generosity, a harvest of it. It will change our chemistry in our body, the body chemistry, to make us more generous people. And as a result, we will be people who reflect God's generosity. You know, the interesting thing in there, and the thing I've always noticed when I meet people who are generous in my lives, generous people always have something to give. Always. Regardless of their current situation, regardless of what's going around them, regardless of the economy, or the fact that the stock market really kind of blew it this week. Generous people give regardless. They give, they always have it to give. And they see giving as a gift. In this passage, if you read it, it talks about God giving freely to us. It talks about us being willing to give generously to other people, and we will see the opportunity to help and to be generous as a gift from God, who continues to give us gifts over and over and over again. The God's generosity through constantly being able to give and understanding that giving is not just some random mandate. It is not God's tax on us to give to ministry and to give to other people. It is a gift that God has given to us to be generous and to be seen as generous people. And I love the fact that what it says here is that generosity does a few things. And it says specifically what it will do to the people of Jerusalem. But it says generosity, first and foremost, glorifies God. People who are generous do what their Father also does. It glorifies Him through their gifts. It meets the needs of other people. It meets their needs. It shows them that maybe people who say they're Christians and say they love Jesus actually also care about those things with which they struggle throughout their lives. Last week when we were discussing the struggle that we have sometimes with spreading the good news of Christ, with evangelism. And the struggle is that so often people have barriers and there are other things in their way. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes those of us who call ourselves Christians and followers of Christ have the means to help remove a few of those barriers through relationship, through spending time with people, through money. We can meet others' needs. But the thing that hit me after the whole thing, this entire passage, was the thing that came out of it that Paul didn't even mention as one of the blessings from Jerusalem. But he says, they will pray for you with a deep affection. Generosity breeds affection. Affection is different than feeling. Right? If Luke would have handed $5 to every person, every homeless person and panhandler in Washington, D.C., they would have felt good. They would have not had necessarily deep affection for Luke. That would make me concerned. But if we are interacting and we are living in a community, and they start thinking of us as truly generous people, not people who have an ulterior motive, not people who are trying to come and help us for the sake of then being able to slide the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ in underneath that, but who genuinely care about them, genuinely care and are giving of themselves, not what's left over or whatever, but truly giving to them, it will develop genuine affection, relationship type affection, beyond the warm fuzzies. That's what we must cultivate here. That's what we must look for as a church. That must be our guiding principle in many ways. This idea of being a church that is generous, people who are generous and legitimately generous. Not, it's the end of the year and I get a tax break generous. When we start talking about this with church specifically, I realize there's baggage. I realize there are people who are out there who believe that the church is only after your money. I have been in many, many churches in my life. I've heard it argued about most of them. I don't know if I've ever actually been in a church that was only after your money. I realize televangelists have made us all look bad. I realize that some televangelists have made us all look bad. I realize there are other things where we've been in situations, and sometimes we've been in, even here at Fellowship of Faith, when we start talking about buying property at the church and start talking about what it would take to have the kind of money to do that, what it's going to take to build a building, and all those types of things, it's uneasy because somehow we don't feel like, we don't understand how that coincides with the gospel of Christ sometimes. And we struggle with it because maybe that's what our dad always said, or that's what our mom always said about churches. All they care about is money. That's all they want. And out of 100 sermons in 2 years, there were 2 sermon messages on money, but those were the 2 they showed up on. And the other 51 were about the saving grace of Jesus Christ, who can change your life eternally. And I realize that we have baggage. I realize some of us have been shamed because when we start talking about tithing, and this does happen in churches, some of the ones I've been in, where if you don't have that 10% mark, that the pastor or someone will make you feel badly because you haven't gotten there, because you're not there. And they will look at you as somehow failing Jesus because you're not tithing. I realize that happens. I realize that it's a struggle sometimes to hear a message about being generous and about giving, particularly about giving to the ministry of the church, because we feel like that we want to make sure the money is not misused. If you are part of this church, and if you're a member of this church, if you've gone through the membership class, or if you've been here any length of time, hopefully you've decided that we don't misuse the money of our church. And I'll tell you that the group of leaders that we have over the last 3 years, since I've been in the process of becoming the lead pastor, and as I've been the lead pastor, their entire goal is to see every penny that we use properly used for the message of Christ. That's one of the reasons that when we began looking at the budget for 2014, and we looked at the fact that we were giving a very minor, actually, we had a mission family that we were supporting, though they were not part of our budget, and at various times certain individuals would just write the check for their support. And there were financial issues happening and things like that. But when we realized that our missions giving was 0%. There was nobody in leadership who said, we're good with that. Every one of them said, we need to at least get to tithing. We need to at least be giving 10% for the sake of the gospel in other parts of the world. And over the last 2 years, and if you look at the budget this week, if you look out at the proposed budget, we are up to about 7.5% in 2 years. And my goal is to be at 20%. I haven't told them that yet. That's my goal. Is to be 20% tithing to somewhere else, to see missions work happen in other parts of the world. Other things we have done, we've moved all of our money that was basically for parties and things that our church did as a community here. We've moved that money to our care and outreach ministry. Because if we say that's what we're going to do, our money should also reflect it, and that's where it's going. It's continuing to change that way. We're continuing to go that direction and finding ways to limit spending on extraneous things. And if you have become a member if you're part of this church as a member, or you're someone who's come for a long period of time and this is your church home, I want to promise you, we're doing everything possible for that money to be used where it needs to go. It's not going into retirement accounts. It's not going into investments. It's not going into all those other things that sometimes churches use, and sometimes they're very helpful. But that's not where it's not where the money is going. And I feel like that I want to tell you that. And as our mission grows, and as our ministry grows, and as the vision God has given us grows, it's still going to require money. Sometimes I think people live in a fantasy world. Reading social media tells me many people live in a fantasy world. But that people, when they look at church, they feel like I can pull out my wallet and I can pull this card out, and this is actually like God's ATM card. Like if I need cash to pay the utilities, I just go and put my PIN number in, and God writes me a check. He sends me cash. Like that's honestly the world in which, well, how are you going to, we've got lighting. How do you pay for lights at your house? It costs money. Same thing here. We've got a mortgage. How do churches are exempt from mortgages? No. But we've got this idea that I can just go, or maybe I print money in the back room. I really don't. Just in case the NSA is watching, I do not print money in the back room. Money comes. The reality is everything that we get, everything we have, is part of this vast volunteer organization called Fellowship of Faith. It's a volunteer organization. It has a mission, and it has bills. And that's the way it is. It's the way it works. It will always work that way. Always. Unless we get a Christian president, then he'll just write us all big checks, right? The churches will all be exempt from everything. That's the way it works. As long as he's a Christian, we're good, right? It's not the way it works. We will always have a mission, and we always have bills. And things that you do to reach out to the community, they cost money. Next week, we're going to have a couple missionaries, one missionary family from Guyana. They're in town. The Mayats are going to come, and they're going to share with us for about 20 minutes. Our walls, I think of them that way. Sean and Bethany Wall, who are missionaries in Papua New Guinea, are going to be Skyping with us for that day. And what you're going to hear is all the amazing stuff that God is doing. And what you're not going to hear from either one of them is how much it costs. But I have had conversations with them. I know. And if you've been in part of those conversations, you know what it costs. Not just what it costs financially, but what it costs from them personally. To be away from family, to be living basically completely and totally dependent upon the generosity of people in another part of the world. You're going to hear about that stuff because that's the reality of it. And that's part of what we do here. And it's called part of what we're called to do as generous followers of Christ. So, when we start talking about tithing a little bit, I was going to get there eventually. Often, Deuteronomy is referenced. We're not going to read from Deuteronomy. Often it's referenced about giving your 10% to the tabernacle and all that. We don't have a tabernacle. The building's pretty solid, although it doesn't sound like it with the wind blowing, but it's pretty solid. They talk about Malachi. Malachi 3, bring your tithe into the church. It doesn't say church. But bring your tithe in and challenge God and see that He will not pour out a blessing on that you can't measure, right? When we start talking about it, often people don't realize that it's also discussed in the New Testament. People who don't like to talk about tithing will tell you it's never talked about in the New Testament. Jesus actually, in a passage, and I'm not going to read it. You don't need to put it up there, Isaac. But in Luke 11, he's actually discussing with some religious leaders how completely and totally messed up they are because they're very, very focused on the minute details of all the things they have to do to make God happy. And in the meantime, they're walking by the people on the street who need help. They're ignoring the needs of the people to whom they've been called to minister. And his response is not, as many people will argue, you should just forget about all that other stuff and you should just focus on this. Forget about the living a holy life. Forget about being people who are looked at as people who are actually followers of God. He doesn't say forget about that stuff. He talks specifically about tithing. He says, you guys will tithe the tiniest little bit of mint or spice. And then while you're doing that, you're walking over someone who is dying and who needs your help. And he says, you should have done the one without forsaking the other. They're both important. You were focused, in the Pharisees, they were focused on the act of doing things, and they had lost the heart. And he was saying, you need to have the heart, but don't lose the actions for the sake of the heart. You know, we are living in a culture that is very emotionally aware of a lot of stuff. We care a lot about all the things that are happening to the people around the world. We even care about lions who get shot by dentists. We care about that stuff, and it tugs at our heartstrings. And the one thing that you'll never hear me say it on Facebook. God has given me the grace to keep my mouth shut, and has also given me the mandate to also do that. But so often, the people who are out and they're posting all these other things, the question I want to ask them is, what are you doing about it? Where is your money going? Regardless of the social issue, regardless of the political issue, regardless of where is your money going? Where is your time going? You have a great heart, but the action is not backing it up. So often when we read scriptures, and Christians will read the New Testament and they'll read the Gospels, and they come down so hard on these religious leaders because of all the things they did and all the rules they kept and all this. And we'll talk about how we don't have to follow the law anymore because of Christ, and we get really, really excited about that. But one of the things that I learned in my history classes about these guys, about these Pharisees and the Sadducees, is these were incredibly devout, very energetic people who really loved God, they thought. And were not looking at all this stuff as this is the stuff I have to do. They chose to do that stuff. They chose it. They were not mandated by someone else. They acted. out of their choice. We cannot abandon the heart for the sake of the action or the action for the sake of the heart. We must do the one without abandoning the others. Did you guys? Okay, I just want to make sure you guys saw that. So here's the deal. How do we begin this? What do we do with all this generosity? How do we determine what the next step if we have decided that we are going to be generous people, that we want God to work through us as he said in 2 Corinthians, where we would become generous people and we will see that our needs are met and we'll take the resources that God has given to us and we will give them so that God will create a harvest of generosity in our minds and our hearts. And here's the first thing I want to tell you. As we come up with this generosity plan, if your immediate thought process as I'm speaking is the word can't, you won't. If your immediate response is, I can't, whatever, we can't tithe, we can't be generous, I can't give, then you won't. When we begin our thought process from the mindset of lacking, we can never get to the place of seeing God's abundance. If we are always looking at hoping that we're going to wait until things get better to do it, it's never going to happen. I've met people who are generous, who are looking for jobs because they're unemployed. I've met people who are generous or millionaires. And I've met misers in both camps. If you believe that you can't, you won't. So here at Fellowship of Faith, when we start talking about generosity, when we start specifically talking about giving to the church ministry and to other things, here's the first thing it has to be. It has to be a priority. It has to be a priority. If you've gone through, what's it called? Financial Peace University, it says it has to be a priority. The first check you write is to God. The second check you write is to yourself. You're supposed to save also, but that's financial peace. You can do that some other time. It's first fruits. Proverbs 3:9 says, bring your first fruits in. Not the leftovers. If you are like me, and you are like most people in the world, if you wait and give God what is left over, He gets negative money. It doesn't zero, it's negative. We can't give Him the leftovers. It must be a priority. It must be part of our budget. I know there are still people in the world who budget. That has to be part of it. It has to be a priority. With the expectation that God gets first fruits. That phrase comes from back in the legal times of the Jewish legal system, law system, Mosaic law, where that's what you were expected to bring in. The harvest came in, the first and best of what you got in, that's what was given to the temple. That's what was given to God. It was an expectation. It was a mandate. But the goal was not you just didn't do it because you had to. It was because out of your reverence and love of God, you were bringing it to Him. That's why if you read the Old Testament, there are multiple places where God even kind of comes back and says, you guys are doing all that, but your hearts are somewhere else. I don't really care about that. If you don't really love me, forget about it. So it has to be a priority. And the other thing is, and this is not a biblical thing other than the tithe element, is it has to be a percentage. in your giving. And I'm not just talking about giving to the church, but in giving to other organizations and things like that, it needs to be a percentage. Now, Malachi 3 says, bring your tithe into the storehouse, which is the word I couldn't remember earlier. To bring it in. The tithe equals 10%. Okay? Your tithe into the storehouse. And basically, it's a place, and Joe Shank and I were talking about this, it's one of the few places in Scripture where God openly challenges you to challenge Him. You bring your tithe in, and you see what happens. You're not going to be able to believe it. You will not contain it. It doesn't mean you're automatically going to be rich. Nothing I've said today has said generous people are automatically rich, and if you give more, you're going to get more. That's not what I'm saying. If I ever say that, fire me. Get somebody else. I was talking to a lady yesterday, goes to a different church, and she said she was challenged to begin tithing. I don't know when she began tithing, but the way that she discussed it, and she's probably in her 70s, the way she was discussing it, it was fairly recent. Now, I don't know what that means, but it was fairly recent. And she said that she was told by someone at her church, if she would start tithing, she would not miss it. And she had a hard time believing that. And then she started tithing. And she looked at me, and I love it, and she's not a member of my church, but she looked at me and she said, I never have. And she was amazed. We have a family at our church that we have a video of that we've shown, and I can't find it. It's the only reason I didn't show it. Plus, I didn't ask permission, and Donna would be really ticked off if I didn't ask her permission first. Who have a story about when they began coming to the church, and they listened to a very similar message to this. And it basically was a challenge. Just start with a small percentage. I know there are other people in this church. I've had other conversations with it. And they had just come out of probably the worst time of their lives. Job that had been had for 30 years was gone. They had just started a business. And they were really trying hard to get the business off the ground. And they came in, they heard a message about priority and percentage giving, and they began doing that. They started with a small number, and then they built up to 10%. The video was made probably 5 years ago. And she says repeatedly in there, we've never had to worry about jobs. We've never had to worry about work. We've never had to worry about whether the bills were going to get paid or not. Now, 5 years later, if I were to ask them, they would probably tell you, some days we wish we didn't have so much work. The number of employees they have increases every week, it seems like. They are there because they took the step of making it a priority and choosing the percentage. And they put God to the test, and God did not leave them hanging. Now, the one thing that didn't happen, because I talked to one of them today, they didn't win Powerball. Which I would have been really happy about too, because I told you they tied, so we'd have been in good shape. It's been a whole different conversation this morning. And they didn't have to quit work. They continued to work. Long hours. But God has blessed them and will bless them. And they will tell you they've never missed that 10%. Set a goal. If you can't do 10%, set a goal. Pick a 1%, 2%. Set a giving goal for your family in 2016. You guys think I'm joking about the Powerball. I'm not. Okay? You guys can freely tithe that if you win it. Set a goal. And then follow through with it. Have something to work toward. Okay, set a goal. Put it out there. This is the percentage we're going to shoot for this year. Or this is where we want to give our money this year. I'll tell you something else as a sidebar. I didn't plan to say this, but I've also had conversations with people who say, I just tithe in a lot of different places. Okay? That's not really the way it works. Particularly if you become a member of the church, okay, because in the covenant you sign, it's in there. If you want to give to other organizations and to other things, do that. But don't forget that we still have bills here. We still have a mission here. And if you have said you're part of it, you will be part of it. There are people in here, and it's not just the ones I've referenced. I just weekly am blessed. That's the one thing I want to talk about a little bit is because it sounds like hopefully I don't think I'm coming off too hard on this. But one of the things that I've always been amazed at is, first of all, the people who give on a regular basis. And I don't do the finances. I'm not the deposit person or the money, paying the bills thing, but just on a regular basis, the generosity, but not just with our regular giving, but when we have special projects and things are coming, like when we do snack packs and we do, which are now part of the budget, or the Christmas boxes, or if there are needs for children at Christmas, or we just find out that someone needs something, or we're working, people are generous in that way, and sometimes very mission-specific generous. And I don't want to come off today with any kind of attitude that I am not incredibly and eternally grateful for those of you who have already who make that effort, who have chosen to be generous and are allowing God to work through that. We are blessed beyond measure of what we have, and God will continue to bless what we have. But set a goal. There are other places that you can give you can give. Maybe you're doing your 10%. Here's one of the other things I would encourage you to, and one of the conversations we're going to be having at our house soon is if you tithe, consider where you need to go. Do you need to do a double tithe? Is that where, there are churches, there are people I know who, and I read a book recently about it, there are people who I've read about, I've never actually met one, who live on a tithe, and they give 90% away. Now, one of the people is Rick Warren. That's because his 10% is massive, okay? Like Bill Gates can live on 0.5%. He's good, okay? But there are other folks who are like us and have just made a decision that we are going to figure out a way that by the time we retire or by the time this event happens, we are going to be living on 10% and giving away 90%. Doesn't mean that they give it all to their church, but they give away 90% of their money. That's a goal. Those are the kind of things that we can look at. And I encourage you, even if you're a tither, begin asking God, how else do you want me to be generous? Where else do you want me to go with it? Tell somebody about these decisions. Tell somebody. I don't mean tell me. I don't mean broadcast it on Facebook. I don't mean any of these things. I'm saying find a person you trust and make it known to them that you have made this decision. That's a new step. That's not normally something that we talk about. We talk about priorities and percentages. Let somebody know so that you can be accountable. So that they can ask you, they can keep up with it, they can check up on you, see how you're doing. Let somebody know. Accountability helps. When you say you're going to give 5% in your head and you tell somebody you're going to get 5%, there's a very different response in your brain. You've made a commitment to somebody. And let's face it, sometimes we can make our brain commitments to Jesus and it really doesn't work all that well. Sometimes we've got to tell somebody. And the response to this, I believe if you take those steps, if you look at those steps, I'm convinced, I've seen it in my own life, I've seen it in the lives of so many other people. If you will make that a priority, if you'll find that and you'll set that goal and you'll allow God to work, you will see the generosity harvest that is discussed in 2 Corinthians 9. You will see it. It's not because you're going to get massive checks in the mail. It doesn't mean that you're going to win the lottery. The harvest of generosity is not necessarily you're going to get more to give. It's that you are going to become more of a giver. You are going, and when we talk about that, and we become people who are truly engulfed by generosity, we become more like the God we serve, who has held nothing back from us, who holds nothing back from us. That's the generosity harvest. It has nothing to do with finances. It has everything to do with becoming more like the God we serve. And isn't that why we come here in the first place? Would you guys pray with me, please?